I like Overwatch. I like the dev team. I genuinely think they're trying to make careful and small adjustments to get better feedback over longer periods of time so as to better influence their decisions without drastically changing the way a hero plays without reason. Most of the time. But this focus on making smaller iterations after longer gaps of time are what can really ruin the experience for hundreds or thousands of daily players who enjoy certain heroes that may be considered low grade, or F tier in other words. The problem with this method is that thousands upon thousands of people play this game on a daily basis, and the amount of time that they're going to invest in playing the game is always going to be greater than that of what the dev team can devote to it in a workday, and as a result, it seems even slower. I understand that development takes time, and that Blizzard may have more information than we do at a glance, but it is slightly concerning when certain heroes sit at the bottom of the barrel for long periods of time because the dev team might be too careful and slow going with their decision making. We're not just talking about a few weeks or even a month either. That wouldn't be so bad. Sometimes a hero sits at the bottom of pick rates for several months, sometimes over a year. While I would never demand a developer work harder or faster because I said so or out of a sense of entitlement, I am willing to voice my concern with a process that appears too slow from the outside looking in. Again, I like Overwatch, and I like the dev team well enough. They seem like genuinely wonderful people, and they are people. Always remember that when providing criticism to a developer at any time. With all that said, I'll move on to the topic of this video. My favorite Overwatch character is still in an awful rut, more than a year after a rework that was supposed to bring her up to par with other heroes. Symmetra is one of the strangest heroes in terms of balancing because against those with less mechanical skill and situational awareness, she can completely clean house and run amok, but her ability to combat those that possess average to good skill and awareness is significantly reduced. Her ability to combat others is based heavily on how well she can set up defenses just ahead of them or get the jump on enemies while maintaining that element of surprise long enough to not get killed for being in the midst of her opponents. Her primary weapon's range is 7 meters, which is currently the 3rd shortest range in the game. Because she doesn't have the health pool of Reinhardt or the defensive capabilities of him or Brigitte, she is severely disadvantaged considering the fact that a large number of characters on the roster have some degree of range and or mobility, and they can completely outclass Symmetra without her even being able to do anything against them. Her primary fire also takes at least 3 seconds of lock-on to a living opponent for it to reach its maximum damage potential, and she has to try and stay engaged lest her weapon power down again, leaving her vulnerable among her opposition. Any hero with ranged combat options has a leg up on Symmetra. McCree, Pharah, Soldier 76, Sombra, Tracer, Hanzo, Widowmaker, Torbjorn, Bastion, Junkrat, Orisa, Zarya, Ana, Moira, and Zenyatta can consistently fight Symmetra from outside of her range with effective results with just their weapons. I'm not even considering their abilities at this point. Reaper, Mei, D.Va, Reinhardt, Roadhog, Winston, and Brigitte are probably the characters who I'd wager have to consistently engage Symmetra within her effective range. But their abilities and health pools help ensure their survival against her even when her photon projector is ramped up to its maximum charge. That means that 15 of 27 heroes are able to effectively combat Symmetra from a position where she cannot fight back, and another 7 can walk right into her area and take it from her. That's also not mentioning that 3 of the other heroes left on this roster, Lucio, Mercy, and Genji, who might be the least effective characters to fight her, still have the option of dealing with her at a range or using their abilities to get away from her before she can deal any kind of significant damage. Her secondary fire has an interesting quality in that it bypasses barriers, but its slow speed makes it ineffective to use at range with any consistency. Symmetra's one proactive ability that gives her any chance of closing a gap or defending herself is Photon Barrier, which is the least effective barrier in the game. It can still be very useful in very specific situations, but it is much more limited than any other barrier used by any other hero. When used defensively to back off or escape, her opponents know that she just blew her one ranged defense and is now vulnerable the moment her barrier has moved past them, especially if she's unable to get out of sight or retreat to an area she currently has defenses placed in. Alternatively, if she uses the barrier to try and close in on an opponent, they can step to the side and hit her around the edges of the barrier, move forward and through if they want to engage her directly, or even use mobility options to retreat or get better positioning against her, and there's not much she can do about it at that point, because again, she just used her one defensive ability, her one proactive ability. Her sentries have no offensive capability, as her range for placing them is fairly short. Deploying them will slow her down for about a second. They themselves take about an extra half second or so to prime before they start doing anything, and with 1 HP, any character merely has to sneeze on them and they're gone, which negates any effort to use them on the fly. All the aforementioned limitations also make them hard to throw up quickly for defensive purposes too. If the bulk of your defenses are set up elsewhere and the enemy team just so happens to pick a route that goes around them, your odds of establishing a new line of defense in time is unlikely. Of all these issues, and even some mild personal ones that I haven't mentioned, I feel that her lack of range is her biggest and most glaring limitation that isn't made up for in her defense and support utilities. But deeper than that, I have a particular issue with Blizzard's design philosophy surrounding her, summed up in a quote from a recent developer update.
Another hero that we get asked a lot about is Symmetra. Symmetra is one that we're still discussing heavily. We don't believe that she needs major buffs. We do believe that she is a very situational character, and that's how she's designed.
I understand that you don't want one hero to be completely unstoppable. I understand that they might want certain heroes to have a natural leg up on others, but the way he worded that does not sit well with me. We do believe that she is a very situational character, and that's how she's designed. I mean, is it just me? Part of a character's design is making them only situationally effective? Is that why Bastion doesn't get attention anymore? Is that why it's taken so long for Blizzard to start looking at Mei and Torbjorn? Never mind that the likes of Tracer, Genji, Soldier 76, Roadhog, and Moira can be treated as round puzzle pieces meant to fit into just about any team composition, Symmetra can only be allowed to be effective within a particular niche. I don't suspect that's what he meant by that line, but it's how it comes across, and the rest of that particular discussion doesn't alleviate that concern.
We do believe that she is a very situational character, and that's how she's designed, meaning that there are going to be occasions where Symmetra is not the right pick. Now, we recognize that right now she doesn't have enough usefulness across the board, and we'd like to give her a little bit more, but that doesn't mean that we believe that she's ever going to be at a place where her pick rate is way beyond where it is right now.
My interpretation. The way we've designed her limits her appeal and functional capacity, and rather than change that when it's obvious that it isn't particularly effective, we're just going to focus on solidifying that niche rather than try to expand her capabilities.
But that doesn't mean that we believe that she's ever going to be at a place where her pick rate is way beyond where it is right now. We think we can improve it, but she is kind of a situational character. She's built to be a defensive character who owns a certain space, and that's the design that we're really excited about right now. Because she has that certain kit and that's how she plays, it's going to be difficult to make her 100% useful in all situations. And again, that's why we strongly encourage that, we want her to be super fun. We want her to be picked more than she is right now, but also consider that in some situations you might want to pick a hero besides Symmetra.
While I could go on about my issues with Blizzard's design philosophy surrounding Symmetra, I'd rather get back into what I usually make these videos about, making my own silly but reasonable suggestions on how to modify a character to try and make them a little more viable, or at least a little more fun. So, thanks, Blizzard! With the announcement of Brigitte and her release, I can now say after getting to test her that I had to throw out my original draft of proposed changes to Symmetra's photon barrier. I spent the last 2 weeks or so spitballing some ideas in my head and eventually settled on focusing on Sym's barrier in an attempt to make her a mild hybrid tank of sorts. By tying her photon barrier into her photon projector like we saw in her comic, A Better World, I was going to suggest allowing her to hold and control a barrier at the cost of so much ammo per second. But now Brigitte is going to fill the tank support hybrid role, and she can heal people while providing a very generous amount of overheal in the form of armor as well. If Symmetra is going to have a chance of competing with other supports in any way after Brigitte's introduction to the game proper, she's going to need significant changes, which has influenced my decisions in these proposed changes. Try to keep as many elements of her kit as possible. Blizzard has made certain assets, animations, voice lines, effects, and so forth for her already, and that work shouldn't just be thrown out if it can be avoided. No healing. Though I take issue with some of their philosophy surrounding Symmetra's design, a non-healing support is an interesting idea that I like, and I aim to keep her that way. Broader playstyle. Blizzard may be fine with trying to keep her in a niche, but my aim is to make her more useful in a variety of different situations and game modes without making her an absolute must-pick. Basically, my aim is to try and suggest changes that would yield a hero that people won't instantly flame you for using on any given map. Symmetra can target the constructs she's already made and right-click them to pick them up and move them. If she right-clicks while holding a construct, she deletes it, and the item goes on cooldown, for the full cooldown cost, to prevent abuse. Symmetra also gets a resource meter with 2 resources added to it. Construct, changed from Sentry Turret. Symmetra's shift button becomes an ability called Construct. Repeatedly hitting shift changes the type of construct Symmetra can create. Construct 1, Sentry Turrets. Since I'm having some fun here, I would like to suggest 1 or 2 significant tweaks to them. 1. Sentries nullify movement abilities on targets. The devs say she's designed to control a certain space, but her sentries are incredibly fragile and capable of being destroyed on accident. As such, I feel like they should have a little more impact on helping her control a space by blocking movement abilities, if not instantly, then at least after a second of exposure or so. Alternatively, sentries add time to ability cooldowns. For every half second that someone is targeted by a sentry, their abilities gain 1 second of cooldown. So for example, if Genji wanders into an area with none of his abilities on cooldown and is suddenly targeted by a sentry, he can immediately back up or use Swift Strike to cross an area should he so choose. But if he fails to react, both Swift Strike and Deflect go on cooldown for 1 second, and continue to gain additional cooldown the longer he's caught. Either of these effects could be modified to apply under certain circumstances, such as someone has to be targeted by a certain number of sentries, or a single sentry can apply the effect, but the target has to be hit for 1 full second before the effect occurs. There's ways to tweak for the best possible use or effect. Neither of these are critically necessary buffs, but they could provide a little extra utility and identity for a hero who lacks it. What I would realistically suggest is to keep them as they are now, but with some minor tweaks to make them more useful, such as increased placement range, deploying faster, arming faster, not slowing Symmetra down when placed, and allowing teammates to see them and their actions through walls like Symmetra does. In addition, the first 6 sentries placed function the same as they always do, and do not use Symmetra's 2 new resources. But any sentries placed after the first 6 use 1 resource each, allowing her to place a maximum of 8 total. Upon destruction or deletion of an extra sentry, the resource used to create them will regenerate after 10 seconds, the same cooldown sentries currently have. Aside from some small quality of life improvements like those I mentioned a second ago, I don't know that they need much more, but the more radical changes could be fun, useful, and interesting. Construct 2, Teleporter. Symmetra can place a 200 HP teleporter with 1 charge. It costs 1 resource to build. At the cost of her second resource, Symmetra can upgrade her teleporter to level 2. A level 2 teleporter gains 2 additional charges and 50 to 75 extra HP. Upon destruction, use, or deletion of a teleporter, the construct goes on cooldown and cannot be rebuilt, while the resource required to replenish it is refreshed over the course of 25 seconds for a level 1 teleporter, and 50 to 55 seconds for a level 2 teleporter. Construct 3, Shield Generator. Symmetra can place a shield generator with 200 HP that gives everyone plus 25 shield HP like her original Photon Shield ability back at release. It costs 1 resource to build and has the same or even a slightly larger range than her current shield generator. At the cost of her second resource, Symmetra can upgrade her shield generator to level 2. A level 2 shield generator provides plus 50 shield HP to itself for 250 HP total, and all allies in its range, which is slightly reduced compared to the live version of the construct. Upon destruction or deletion of a level 1 shield generator, the resource required to replenish it will be refreshed over the course of 15 to 20 seconds, and 40 to 45 seconds for a level 2 construct. For the duration of that time, the construct cannot be redeployed. Construct details. Buildings are upgraded by channeling the hard light from her weapon into the construct of her choice. Basically, after creating a teleporter or shield generator, shoot either building with her gun for a short while to upgrade it, and the second resource will be used upon successfully upgrading the chosen construct. If a level 1 teleporter is being upgraded as its single charge is used, the construct will remain until Symmetra upgrades it to level 2 successfully, or until she stops channeling her weapon into it. That way her intentions, goals, and strategies aren't unintentionally ruined by her teammates' needs. Constructs cannot be rebuilt while the resources used to create them are refreshing to avoid abuse of cooldown times on different constructs by rotating them. Without this restriction, a Symmetra could delete a level 1 shield generator after a level 1 teleporter was used or destroyed, and have the resource refreshed in 15 to 20 seconds to create another level 1 teleporter, while the resource for the previous teleporter was technically still refreshing. Basically, while the resources are refreshing, the individual constructs will also have their own cooldowns that you'll have to be aware of. Symmetra doesn't heal, and her only support abilities are her ultimates, of which she can only use one at a time. My suggestions are meant to grant her more consistent team support utilities and allowing the players using her to focus on getting more teammates to the front line, provide their teams with more maximum health to defend an objective or push one, or let them provide both simultaneously, though in a somewhat weaker capacity. Since Symmetra has to compete for a support slot on any given team, she needs a few things tilted in her favor to allow her more utility and overall use. So I ultimately decided that having 3 charges on a level 2 teleporter would give her more reason to be picked compared to a healing support like Mercy. These changes also leave room for her ultimate to be changed to something more engaging and proactive. One of my biggest beefs with Symmetra at present is that her ultimate abilities are incredibly passive and typically require her to disengage from battles upon acquiring them, when the majority of other heroes can use theirs to actively help decide the course of a battle. At present, the short-range, no-mobility hero has to disengage so as to set up either of the only team support abilities she has, somewhere off by herself in the backlines, while her team potentially fights on the objective with one less teammate present. Sure, they still have these drawbacks as standard abilities too, but at least it gives her room for a more proactive ultimate that allows a player to feel more engaged with their team, and like they're actively making a difference with their ultimate, as well as passively making a difference through Symmetra's standard abilities. This is probably Symmetra's best ability at present, but also probably the worst barrier in the game as well. Personally, I find its best application is blocking the ults of D.Va and Pharah, but the usefulness takes a mild hit outside of those two scenarios. When used, it appears a few meters in front of Symmetra and hurls itself at average hero running speed in the direction she happens to be looking when she creates it, before passing through the enemies ahead of her and bursting on contact with a wall, if it doesn't get destroyed first. It can be useful if a Symmetra player wants to try and close a gap so they can actually use their weapon on an enemy, or put a barrier in front of allies without jeopardizing their own positioning. But in both of those instances, the photon barrier typically ends up moving past enemies on its own after the briefest of seconds, or the enemies simply sidestep or move through it themselves to continue pressing their attack. Let's see if we can make it more interesting. Idea 1. I've seen several suggestions for making photon barriers add barrier health to allies who pass through them, and I think that could be useful. Say, 75 to 100 barrier HP that bleeds for 25 HP a sec, meaning that it'll last for a maximum of 3 to 4 seconds if an enemy isn't damaging it. Idea 2. Allies that Symmetra's barriers pass through reduce any active cooldowns by 2 seconds. Only once per barrier though. That alone could be an interesting buff, but you could also set it to cause active enemy cooldowns to be extended by 2 seconds, or have all enemy abilities get a 2-second cooldown upon the barrier passing through them. Idea 3. Quickly pressing E deploys Photon Barrier as it currently exists. Pressing and holding E applies a maximum of 2 sentry charges to it. When released, the barrier will function as normal until impact with the surface, whereupon it creates sentries. A barrier with 1 sentry charge will create a sentry where the center of the barrier impacts, while a barrier with 2 sentry charges will create sentries at the opposite ends of the barrier's horizontal axis. If the impacted surface is too thin to create sentries in that capacity, it will instead create the sentries at the opposite ends of the vertical axis. If that's also not possible, it will create a single sentry at the impact point and refund the other turret charge. Idea 1. In this iteration, Photon Barrier could be used to actively block damage as it does now, while also giving teammates a brief buffer against any enemies that the barrier simply flies past, or who choose to move past it on their own. Idea 2. This would give Photon Barrier an interesting identity as an aggressive barrier that enemies would be better off avoiding rather than confronting or simply pushing through, but those comfortable with the skill of their current hero's weapon could choose to ignore the drawbacks if they want to try and keep the pressure on. Idea 3. Combined with some of the sentry changes I've suggested, this could have interesting impacts on the game, but this is probably the least useful utility buff Photon Barrier could get. With Symmetra's sentries functioning the way they do presently, they aren't particularly potent by themselves or in low numbers. It could potentially let Symmetra play some mind games or even get some sneaky assists from further away than she typically operates, but it would probably have the least measurable effect of the ideas I've suggested. There's no denying Symmetra's weapon, the Photon Projector, can be pretty good and even powerful in the right hands. This is more notable at lower levels of play against those whose aim may not be as proficient as others. However, against more skilled opponents, her short range, low HP, and need to ramp up her damage leaves her too vulnerable, even in her optimum operational range. That said, despite its incredibly short range, her primary fire is still largely fine to me after all this time. I'd also hesitate to change her right-click, Energy Ball, in any significant way as well. It has its uses, even if it's a bit too slow to be consistently useful. If I were to suggest any changes, it would be one of two. 1. The Photon Projector is ramped up by 1 level for each target hit with a fully charged orb. This would reward Symmetra for managing to hit enemies with this particularly slow ability and prepare her for upcoming engagements. 2. Symmetra can hold a fully charged orb longer, maybe at the cost of ammo draining, before choosing to launch it. I wouldn't say indefinitely because that might make her CQC capability a bit overbearing if she could manage to hit you for 125 damage to start a fight and then immediately start microwaving you. Other than that, any change I could suggest would require changing numbers elsewhere in her gun, which I hesitate to do. So big shock, when you take a character's ultimate abilities and tone them down into regular abilities, it leaves an opening for something new in the Q slot. Upon activation of Warped Reality, Symmetra performs a short dance or hand gesture. If she performs the act without interruption, i.e. CC, stun, or death, Symmetra creates a visible 10 to 15 meter ring of light around herself for 8 to 10 seconds. This is Symmetra's reality now. At this point, all allies within the visible 10 to 15 meter ring of light receive the following buffs, while all enemies within the ring of light and in Symmetra's line of sight receive the following debuffs for the duration of Warped Reality. Allies. Active cooldowns are fully reset when her ult is first activated. This could be tweaked to react differently with certain abilities if necessary, but I insist that one should never nerf teamwork. 50% reduction of ability cooldown times. This modifier allows Symmetra to synergize well with a lot of heroes across the board. Offensive characters like Sombra, Soldier 76, Doomfist, and Genji can use their skills more frequently in a push. Defender-type heroes typically have longer cooldowns on their abilities, and with Symmetra aiding them, they would get the opportunity to flex those abilities a little more frequently. Tanks tend to have flexible abilities between damage dealing and defensive skills. Symmetra's buff would assist them and her team. Support heroes save lives, and with Symmetra's help could do it more effectively, even though she doesn't provide healing of her own. 10 to 20% ultimate charge rate increased. Ults can turn the tide of a game, whether offensive or defensive. Helping her team to get these abilities could be the final push to help someone get a timely ult that could decide a match. Enemies. 25 to 50% increase of ability cooldown times. I wanted to keep Symmetra set to a certain theme with a lot of the suggestions I've made, and as you can obviously see, my attention was focused on affecting cooldowns. Symmetra has no offensive abilities. All she has is her gun, and even with my tweaks, she doesn't have any aggressive abilities, so I focused on having her affect the other heroes who do rely on abilities for burst damage, extreme mobility, and utility. In a friendly sense, she helps allies get their abilities back to their benefit, and the opposite side of the coin was to have her drain or negatively affect cooldowns in some capacity. I went with the latter. Prevents the use of ultimate abilities within her radius. A support hero who alters those on her playing field was the idea I had when thinking about the effects of this ultimate. Since I focused on having her affect abilities, I didn't want her to end up being accused of being a Sombra clone, so I decided to set my attention on cooldown times instead of outright blocking the use of abilities. When all was said and done, however, for a character who claims ownership over reality and alters the perceptions of those around her, the denial of ultimates seemed like a fitting pièce de résistance for a new battlefield-altering ultimate. She alters the state of the battlefield where the two teams engage each other, and the alterations she makes allows her team a chance to cut loose and utilize the defining skills of their chosen heroes to better hold or press an objective. But generally, this new ultimate allows her to alter the flow of any given teamfight without being too overbearing. By reducing the time on ability cooldowns, resetting any abilities currently on cooldown when activated, and increasing the ultimate gain rate for teammates, she allows them the freedom to cut loose with their more potent abilities and helps them ready their ultimates, while simultaneously protecting her team by preventing the enemies from using their ultimates and extending the cooldown times of enemies who would choose to use their abilities against Symmetra and her team. Symmetra can move or delete her constructs. Symmetra gets a resource bar with 2 resources. Construct. Symmetra's ultimate abilities are now significantly toned down and are integrated into a single cooldown-oriented ability with her sentries, and cost 1 resource to build. Both can be built simultaneously at the cost of being notably weaker than they are in live, or the second resource can be used to make either one stronger at the cost of not being able to build the other. Warped Reality. A new ultimate ability that provides a variety of supportive abilities to her teammates and debuffs to her enemies that alter the playing field of any given teamfight. Welcome to her reality. And that's all I've got this time. Boy, a year and a half later and we're still here at this point. Symmetra is at a severe disadvantage and needs some real help. I know Blizzard is looking into her, but I'm worried about that one part of their design philosophy surrounding her. And I have genuine concerns that they may not ever give her the same flexibility every hero should have. I'm not saying she shouldn't have counters, but she shouldn't have as many counters as she currently does. She should be able to provide some consistent supporting abilities like the other support heroes, and she deserves to have a more engaging ultimate ability that allows her to be actively present on the battlefield and affect a noticeable change in the flow of battle without having to leave the front. Maybe it's too much, maybe not. Sadly, there's no way to allow us a chance to find out. Those of us who love this hero are just going to have to trust Blizzard to make the right moves to bring our Master Architect up to par. Ball's in your court, Overwatch team. We'll be waiting, we'll be watching. Until next time, take it easy, YouTube. Hard Light Barrier. An AoE barrier channeled by Symmetra's dancing, locking her into place that provided...
I hate you. I hate